What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook and welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. So as you guys can probably see, I have been busy spraying paint on all of the kitchen cabinet parts for the kitchen cabinets in the Not So Tiny house. And I figured I'd go ahead and do a video on kind of my process and my recommendations for spraying paint, or really polyurethane as well, on kitchen cabinets or any other furniture. If you guys have watched my videos, you'll know that I love spraying finishes. It is so much faster and easier. I think you get better results. I've been doing it that way for years, and I would highly recommend it if you're looking to tackle a big project like refinishing kitchen cabinets. So I'm going to break up this video into three sections. First, I'm going to talk about kind of the equipment you might need and some accessories that I would recommend that are going to make your life a lot easier. Next, I'll talk about some different paint and primer options and kind of the different types that are in those categories, because it can be really confusing, and I'm no paint expert, but I think I have a decent handle on it. And then finally, I'll talk about the process of actually spraying finish on the cabinets. I'll also include some tips if you're refinishing the cabinets, so you guys will get the best results. So I guess let's go ahead and start it off talking about the equipment. So let's start with kind of the most important piece of equipment, the sprayer itself. And for a DIYer or kind of hobbyist like myself, I would highly recommend an HVLP system, which stands for high velocity, low pressure. And these come in a couple of different formats. The first of which is a turbine-based system, which basically means a motor is going to generate the air pressure needed to go through the hose into the gun and atomize your finish. And they sell turbine units that have the turbines in the gun themselves. That makes the gun kind of heavy, and usually those are on kind of cheaper models, so I'd probably stray away from those. I much prefer a turbine system where it's on the floor, so you're not carrying that around the whole time, and then the air is sent to your gun. And I've used a bunch of turbine-based systems over the years. I started with one from Earlex, I've used one from Fuji Spray, I've used one from Rockler, which is made by Earlex, and the one I use on this project is made by Wagner. And the only reason I went with the Wagner on this one is because the cup holds a lot more paint, so it just meant I had to refill the cup a lot less frequently, which just made things go a little bit faster. The other major category in HVLP spray systems is compressor-based spray guns. And you can get these spray guns for super cheap. I know like Harbor Freight has some for around 15 bucks, and you know, with their 20% off coupon that always seems around, you can get close to 10 bucks for a spray gun, which is certainly dirt cheap. But there is a caveat there, and it's that you'll need a pretty beefy compressor to be able to supply enough air to properly atomize your finish. I would say at a minimum a 2 horsepower compressor with an output of around 6 CFM at 40 PSI. That would be the absolute bare minimum I would recommend. You also need to make sure you have really good dry air when you're spraying finish with an HVLP system hooked up to a compressor, so some sort of filtration or moisture removal system would be a really important add-on there as well. The last category that I'm familiar with for spraying cabinets would be something like an airless sprayer. I have a Graco Magnum X7, and I haven't used it for any kind of fine finish work. I've only used it for spraying walls, but I know you can use it for cabinets. You just need to get a smaller tip size so that the volume of paint and the particles are smaller, but I think you can get very good results with one of those systems as well. So once you've got your sprayer picked out, there are a couple accessories that I would really recommend to make your life a little easier. The first of which is some sort of turntable or spray stand. And I use this one from Paintline, which is a little pricey, but you can definitely DIY these with Lazy Susan kits and things like that. Basically, they allow you to stand in one place and turn your workpiece rather than trying to walk around your workpiece, which can be really tricky, dragging the hose around. You also end up spraying paint all over the place, whereas if you have a turntable, you can just kind of focus everything into one corner or one area. Another big recommendation would be some kind of drying rack. Again, you can either purchase these or DIY them, but basically if you're doing a whole kitchen's worth of cabinet doors and drawer fronts, you are gonna run out of room unless you have just a massive space to paint in. And so as you can see, these drying racks allow you to stack pieces vertically. It keeps them nice and organized, and that way you can spray one side, let it dry for a while, spray the other side, and put it back on the rack, and really makes things a lot easier to manage rather than having every horizontal surface in your garage or shop covered in cabinet parts. If and when you do run out of space on your drying rack, I would definitely recommend picking up some of these painter pyramids. They are hugely helpful in keeping your wet paint from sticking. Basically, they only contact your workpiece at one small point. Super helpful, and I would have a couple dozen of these on hand for sure. Another recommendation, if you're gonna be spraying a lot of doors with Euro style kind of cup hinges, are some of these Rockler SureHook 360 holders. They allow you to hang the door from kind of one cable from that hinge cup, which doesn't need to get painted anyway because it's gonna be covered by the hinge. And that way you can rotate the door, get it nice and sprayed, and leave it hanging there to dry, and just super efficient. So I think the moral of the story here is really just a way to manage the huge volume of parts you're gonna have if you're refinishing a whole kitchen. So my first recommendation when picking a paint and primer for spraying would be to go water-based, especially if you're a DIYer working out of your garage or maybe a small shop, because the fumes are gonna be a lot less severe than something like a solvent-based or oil-based finish. And even in this big shop environment, I don't have very good ventilation, so I pretty much use nothing but water-based finishes, and water-based finishes also have the advantage of drying a lot faster than oil-based finishes. So generally speaking, it seems like enamel paint is pretty much the go-to when painting cabinets. And again, enamel paint comes in both water-based and oil-based. I went with Total Boat Elixir, which is a water-based marine grade enamel paint that I've used a bunch in the past on furniture projects with really good results. And just to give you an idea, I used almost 3 gallons of paint on this project, and I didn't do a coat of primer because this paint was self-priming. That said, Total Boat does sell a primer, their topside primer, which I have used on the exposed rafter tails on the tiny house because that was outside and I didn't really have to worry as much about fumes, and it covers really well. So if you have a way to get good ventilation, you might consider adding a coat of primer before doing your painting. There are also plenty of other primer options out there, including shellac-based primers, which I really like because they dry super quick, and while they do have fumes, they're not as bad as solvent or oil-based products. I guess technically shellac is solvent-based, but still, it's alcohol, it's not as bad, it dissipates pretty quickly, and it dries super quick, plus you can pick it up at any home center. I know Zinsser makes a shellac-based primer that works really well. The other bonus of using a shellac or solvent-based primer before a water-based paint is it's not gonna raise the grain on bare wood. If you're starting with bare wood, water is gonna cause those little fibers in the grain to raise, and that's gonna be super rough, so you are gonna have to knock that down with some sanding after the first or second coat. Also, besides paint, there are a couple of other options, especially if you're working with wood. I know General Finishes sells a pigmented polyurethane, which I've used a bunch in the past. Also, Sherwin-Williams sells a pigmented lacquer called Chem Aqua, and that's a water-based lacquer. All right, so I think that covers the basics of choosing a paint and primer, so let's move on to the actual process of spraying paint on the cabinets. All right, so step number 1 is gonna be disassembling everything, removing all of the doors and drawer fronts and all of the hardware. And if you're refinishing an existing kitchen, or even if you're building one new, I would highly recommend labeling your parts so you know how they all go back together. And what I like to do is basically Sharpie on a number on the back of the drawer front and Sharpie on the same number on the front of the drawer box, both of which will be hidden in the kind of finished product. And then you can throw a piece of painter's tape over the number on the drawer front, which is gonna get painted over, so that way you don't lose it. You can do the same thing with doors. You can Sharpie the number in the hinge cups. Next is one of the less fun parts of this process, and that is prep. And really, prep is essential to getting good adhesion and good results. So in my case, since I was building new cabinets, I sanded everything with 180 grit with a random orbit sander, and then broke all of the edges by hand, also with 180 grit. And sharp edges are a big thing to kind of avoid, because the sharper an edge is, the less paint coverage there will be, and the more susceptible it's gonna be to dings and dents showing through. And if you're refinishing cabinets, I would probably start by degreasing, because pretty much every cabinet that has been sitting there in a kitchen for a while is gonna have some amount of grease or oils from your hands on it. So start with a degreaser and then do the same kind of sanding work. And then once you're done sanding, I would vacuum all the surfaces and wipe everything down with a tack cloth or a wet rag, just to make sure you don't have any dust left over. Next, you can set up your spray area, and if you're refinishing cabinets, that'll be both probably inside your house and maybe in your garage. And when you're spraying paint on cabinets, it is gonna get everywhere. Just expect every surface to be touched with overspray. So I would go nuts, definitely dextrify your kitchen and your garage. Luckily, some of the kind of finer overspray that ends up in the air and lands on some of your surfaces is really just gonna be dust, because it's already dry at that point. So you can vacuum some of that up, but still I would much rather overdo it than underdo it and end up having to repaint, your walls or ceilings, or clean it off of your floor or something like that. And the last big thing to consider when setting up your spray area is some kind of ventilation, especially if you're gonna be using solvent or oil-based paints or primers. You do not want to spray in an enclosed environment with no ventilation because really not good for you to breathe. You should certainly be wearing a respirator. Try to crack a window, open a door, get a fan running, just to try to get some of that out of the room you're working in. All right, so now that your spray area is set up, you can get the paint into your gun and get it all set up. In my case, I'm actually using up a bunch of other colors of this same paint I had just because I knew I was gonna be using a lot of paint on this project and they'd be covered up anyway. But it is a good idea generally to strain the paint when you're pouring it into your spray cup. I didn't do that on this step, but that will help to avoid any clogs from any little dried bits of paint that end up in your spray cup. Once your paint is in the spray gun, you can do some test spraying to kind of dial in your spray width, your material flow rate, and your air pressure. And all of these things are gonna affect your atomization and how effectively the air pressure is gonna be able to break up that paint into particles so you get a nice, even finish. And if you're spraying a super thick finish, you might want to slow down your flow rate and up your air pressure so you get better atomization. Or if you're doing the opposite, spraying a super thin finish, you probably want to back off the air pressure and pump up the flow rate so that you get enough coverage per coat. And once you have your sprayer dial in, you can get to spraying and go ahead and spray on that first coat on all of your parts and pieces, whether that first coat is a coat of primer or a coat of paint like it was in my case. Also, one other tip here is don't waste paint on areas that are gonna be hidden. There's really no reason to do it. As you can see, I'm leaving the sides and backs of these cabinets unfinished because when they're butted up to each other and screwed to the walls in this kitchen, you'll never see them. They don't need finish really, and it would just be a waste of money. Once everything's dried after that first coat, you're probably gonna need to go ahead and sand things, scuff sand things. I would recommend using something like 320 grit sandpaper there because you really do not want to sand through that coat. Also, you can tell if your paint or primer is dry when you sand it and it ends up with kind of a fine dust rather than gumming up your sandpaper. If it's gumming it up, give it another couple hours to dry before continuing sanding. Finally, once you're done sanding, vacuum everything off and wipe it down with a tack cloth or a wet rag. After that, it's really just rinse and repeat for your second and third or even fourth coats if you decide to go that route. You probably don't need to sand between coats unless you end up with a lot of drips that you have to touch up with a brush or something and you want to just smooth that out. But luckily, you only have to sand, in my opinion, once during this kind of painting or finishing process. Also, another thing is you don't really need to clean out your gun between coats, especially if you're going to be spraying multiple coats in a day. And I know when I first got into spraying, that was a question I had and I thought it would be such a pain to have to clean the gun every day, but really those guns are pretty much airtight in the spray cup and I've left them for 2 or 3 days at a time with no issues. Usually all I'll do is wipe off any extra finish on the spray tip before I finish up for the day, and then when I get back to spraying, I'll open up the cup and give everything a good stir to make sure any of the solids that separated are back in suspension. And finally, once you're done spraying, I would give your pieces at least a couple of days to cure before you get to reassembly because your paint is still gonna be super soft even after it's technically dry to the touch. It's still gonna be easy to dent and scratch. If you give it 3 or 4 days, it's gonna be a lot more durable and a lot more resistant to scuffs. And when you're reassembling things, you're just gonna do that. It's kind of hard to avoid. And once again, if you labeled your parts and pieces, reassembly shouldn't be too difficult. And once you're done with that, you have a finished, refreshed kitchen or new kitchen cabinets, like in my case. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I've really been meaning to do a video on how to spray finish on furniture and cabinets for a long time, and I'm glad to finally have knocked it out. And in case you're wondering, the process of spraying something like polyurethane or a clear finish is gonna be very, very similar. Same setting up the spray gun, getting your spray pattern down, spraying the first coat, sanding it if you've raised the grain, and then spraying your second or third or fourth coat after that. So if you guys enjoyed this video and aren't already, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. Also, I'll link to all the tools and materials I talked about in the video description below in case you guys want to check out the specifics of what I was talking about. I guess until next week, guys, thanks for watching and happy building.